Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Polity's podcast. We are getting close to the end of a second season of Gender, and we've been discussing, Maria and I. Hi, Maria.
Hey, Mark.
The roots of transgenderism, or at least what we see as the sort of, if not direct causes, the sort of influences in our culture that constrain our imagination in such a way to make something like transgenderism appear to be
reasonable.
Reasonable, exactly.
Right.
And we've been discussing a lot. We apologize. The last episode, we were very tired. We both watched it and said that looks sleepy. So I'm sorry for putting
you
on
can watch the energy drop. I'm sorry if that happens again today.
I promise you that it's not all as boring as it sounds. But today,
I have an excuse. I ran a half marathon yesterday, so I'm still tired.
You are tired.
You have no excuse.
Zero, just children.
Okay, that's a pretty good excuse, actually.
No, I think children are a lame excuse. They're just very convenient. They're always at hand. So, you never really have to live up to any particular ideals once you have children, because you can always claim that they're the reasons that you've been thwarted from otherwise attaining a sort of celebrity god status.
I think that sounds great.
No, it is. No, this is a reason to get married. New polity. Get married to always have an excuse. All right. Today we're going to talk about pornography. And there are two ways to talk about pornography. One is to be frank about it, and the other is to sort of try and veil the horrors that are within. We're going to try to do a little of both. And for that reason, if you are suffering from pornography addiction, number one, we're praying for you. But number two, this might not be the episode to watch. Now, granted, I also think that if you're suffering from pornography addiction, my prayer is that this will be an episode that can help you develop an interior critique of it. So unfortunately, there's really no way to do this besides you taking a moment and in prudence discerning within your own conscience what you can handle. We are going to try and not be explicit wherever we don't have to be. But if there's a point where we really need to clarify what exactly we're talking about and not leave it languishing in obscurity, we're going to try to name what we can name. So pray about it, think about it, and if you're still on for the ride, we can begin.
Okay.
Fair enough. So, pornography is the chief form of sexual education for the modern American male, and I would presume also the European male, and I would generally presume also just the male at this point. Mm-hmm. Pornography has gone from a sort of secretive and dirty thing that circulated, as long as people could draw from.
Well, you'd have to work to find it.
You have to work to find it, or it was simply, it had a certain crudity to it. Like we find graffiti on ancient Roman walls of pornography. You have the decadents drawing basically pornographic images and circulating them around each other at the turn of the century, things like
novels,
that. Yeah. And, and then there's always the sort of descent and decay of literature into the pornographic, which has afflicted mankind ever since he could write.
That was Mark Twain's first published book.
Really?
Yeah, it makes me dislike him and Tom Sawyer even more.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
I have to teach Tom Sawyer, and I can't stand it.
Well, I will be talking a little bit about this, but pornography is, as it is in life, it is in literature, which is it's a safe bet. So like you might not be able to assure yourself that you're capable of producing something that has a real effect on the other, but you can always just skip that difficulty and show him something arousing that you can already have a sort of guaranteed effect. This is why, most technology, as it's proliferated, sells through sex, both in advertising and then, strictly speaking, on this, the proliferation of the smartphone is obviously just the same thing as the proliferation of constant pornography, which is where we're at today, which is a novel situation in which every man and every woman has in their pockets a immediate access to watch people prostitute themselves. And the average age of exposure to pornography is 13, I think. It's a little later for women. I believe that's another year, but for boys, essentially, it's 13. Obviously, it can go much younger than that. And this, I think, is particularly important because the average age in America, anyways, when someone loses their virginity is at 17. And to be clear, but that doesn't mean everyone does. That's just the average age that they do. So for most men, anyways, by like half of men, for instance, between 17 and 20 are still
pushed
virgins.
Back a little. Yeah, because I know that the statistics have changed.
Yeah, we're having sex a lot less premarital sex, but not less pornography use. So we'll get into that discussion a little bit. But the point to see at the outset is that right in the period of human development where we're most coming alive to the world, like at 13, puberty's hitting.
You have all these questions like, who am I? What is going on with my body?
Yeah, there's that. And then there's also just, you start to fall in love with things. You're incredibly aware of the beauty of the world, of nature. You're starting to just open up and develop as a person.
Maybe you were just a very romantic kid.
Yeah. I think everyone else was just hiding it and pretending to be jocks. They were looking at the flowers too. But all in all, it's a time of great formation. Mm-hmm. And it's all of nature kind of holds its breath because a lot hinges on people being good to children at that age, because their formative powers are there. Now, what this means is that our first experience of sexuality, what it means to have sex, to be aroused, what it means to be a sexual body, to be a sexual person, comes first through pornography, hardcore pornography. And then there's this sort of 4 to 8 year period, which that is, generally speaking, can't obviously speak for every case, but just generally, statistically speaking, that is the main way in which sex is known, experienced, discussed, is through this pornographic experience. And then 4 to 8 years later, you have your first sexual experiences. So the point here is that pornography takes the lead. Pornography takes the sort of structuring effect where you learn there and then you enact in the real world. You learn through the screen, you enact in the real world. And this is really the major difference, and it's why it's worth talking about pornography in its relationship to transgenderism, because there's a novelty to it, not to the existence of pornography, but to the almost universalization of it as an article of consumption and a universalization of it as the source of our sexual
sex ed, basically.
Yeah, sexual education. Makes sense, sort of.
Yeah, well, I think it could be helpful to kind of back up and talk about what the goal of this particular series has been, which is not to it's not like we're presenting a bunch of slippery slope arguments like, well, you have capitalism, so now we have transgenderism. Yeah. And we have pornography, and then obviously you're going to get transgenderism. It's not a slippery slope argument, but it's trying to understand how our imagination and our habits have been changed by the landscape in which we live, the way that we do economics, the way that we work as men and women, the way that we experience coming to know our sexual identity. That's going to form our imagination. It's going to form our habits. And it's not like any one of those things in particular is going to forcibly move you down a particular route. But it does open up the space for things like transgenderism to seem plausible, to seem reasonable, because we're already habituated to unnatural things anyway, to viewing people, to viewing sex, to viewing what it means to be man and woman in a somewhat distorted way to begin with, which I think can help us give a lot more sympathy, to not look at someone in that position as just being crazy. And then also I think to understand ourselves too.
Totally.
Because those kinds of habits we're all affected by it.
And we always need to be aware of the difference between generations and the reception of different habits. So, for a generation, for instance, that starts the practice of contraception, there's a certain maintenance of an understanding of the body as having a fertility cycle, of going on, and as being something we sort of receive and operate with, and then the ability to use contraception is operating within that. The next generation that's sort of raised on contraception doesn't have this same relationship to it that the previous one does. So for them, it's just what your mom gives you when you turn 13. For the next generation, it's just management from the beginning of what you do not know.
Right.
And so
it becomes nature for you. This is the world. And once you grow up, like, I experience my body as being a machine that's not working properly, and so I have to feed it like these certain chemicals so that it can work properly. Because I think that is kind of the mindset that you have to get in. Like, when you're taking a medicine, and medicine's supposed to make you well, make you function properly.
Therefore, my body is sick.
Yeah,
absolutely. But I think really well-meaning people who are even sort of self-described as conservative and have a antipathy towards transgenderism, they see it as a grave harm in society. They miss this point, and they can't see that the things that they do, generationally speaking, are different for the next generation. So it's like, a generation prior to me basically normalized having plastic surgery as just part of what you did to be pretty, to be good looking, and normalized things like breast enhancement surgery. And again, this is something that's becoming more and more available to people as the technologies become cheaper. But for children growing up with parents who enhance their sexual bodies through surgery, who are also contracepting their sexual bodies through medicine, what they're receiving is not the same image of like an improvement on something existing, but again, they're seeing a sort of fundamental.
This is how you take care of the body. This is what you do.
Yeah. So when transgenderism is proffered as a sort of idea where it says you could be in the wrong body, we have these drugs and we have these surgeries whereby the body can be reshaped and reordered so that you can be in the right body. Whereas to the previous generation, it's like a bridge too far. For the new generation, it's like, that's what mom does. That's what dad does. That's what dad expects, at least. Right. And so we're raised on it, and being raised on something is very different than starting to do something within your adult life. And I think pornography is like that too. So I think that it can seem odd to a previous generation who had pornography as sort of like Playboy magazines or something like that. And we're certainly brought into the age of internet pornography as adults to understand why we can make an argument that pornography, which is kind of a manly heterosexual sphere, pretty much, could possibly be any kind of source of something like transgenderism, which is basically, effeminate in some way. And again, I think what's missed in that presumption is the difference between receiving pornography within a kind of world that didn't have it, and then pornography being your introduction period to sexuality, and then frankly, just the degree of pornography that having a phone enables you access to. Okay, so all that being said, you're right. Not a slippery slope argument. We're not saying because you do one bad thing, you're going to do another bad thing. But the human heart, the human soul is a reasonable one. And unreasonable things are rejected. And so there has to be a sort of preparation to believe certain lies in order to believe larger lies. There has to be a preparation to have certain habits in order for to form new habits. So pornography is really interesting because don't move the microphone away.
Alex is
it's a bad gesture. Okay, so what is pornography? Well, I think most fundamentally, it involves a fantastic, when I say that word, I mean fantasy, a fantastic identification with the sexual body of another person. And this is fundamental to the way it works. I was just telling you the story, I'll tell it again. I remember the first time I ever saw a pornographic image, I was actually on a NATO base in Germany, but I was with my friend and I was with the older brother, and we were watching some movie. I didn't know it was pornographic. I was only idly watching it, but then a pornographic image arrived, And my response was to roll off the bed. I just like closed my eyes and rolled off the bed and groaned. Ah. And I was mocked, just relentlessly mocked by the older brother for being gay. And we'll have a lot to say about this particular trope, because it is a trope, but it does happen. But what I realize now looking at it is that, pornography, when it strikes someone who is not prepared for it, when it just leaps out at you in some way, is disgusting. It has to involve some willingness to identify with what's happening in order for it not to appear sort of grotesque and violent and disruptive. So it's the fundamental way it operates, is to imagine that you are the person acting out the act. Now, very typically, as we know, this is male. So typically speaking, pornography is an identification of a boy with a older male in that older male's act of having sex with a woman. I say having sex, any sort of, sexual act that,
yeah.
And I think the first thing to note is this is really weird.
Yes, like third party observation, identification is definitely a very strange way to begin your sexual education. In order for me, in learning about what sex is and learning about what it means to be a man, I am imagining myself as this other person.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that the way that sex is presented to us is first through an act of disidentification with our own bodies and a sort of creation or an affinity with this avatar body. And then we identify with it. And then this is where we derive the pleasure from. We derive the pleasure from the identification with that, with the other body. And the subsequent sexual experience with a living person is typically, because of this, begins as a sort of version of pornography rather than being the other way around, where you have a experience of sexuality and then the pornographization of it. You instead have that act of identifying with another person's, especially another person's genitalia, and then that gets sort of shifted, or it, I think, becomes challenged by real people, by real sexuality. So obviously, if this is an accurate description of what is happening most basically in the act of watching pornography, which is how everyone is increasingly introduced to sex, then there's obviously a sense in which normal, quote unquote, normal pornography is trans. And I don't mean that in the sense of involving the opposite sex yet, like your opposite sex. I mean it in the sense of...
the same kind of habitual movement is there of identifying with a body that is not your own, disassociating from your own body.
Yeah. Like if you were to imagine, someone on a therapist's couch saying something to the effect of, well, what I do is I imagine I'm an older man and I am making love with someone else, and this is how I have sexual pleasures. I achieve it through this method. We would immediately, given the context, be like, well, you're going to need help. You're going to need some help out of that because that's going to be unhealthy to your life.
Right.
But the moment that it's pornography and this identification is being made, it's like, well, that's normal. That's what kids do. That's what boys do, especially. But I think we can see right away that the act of identification and the separation of yourself from your body is, while I'm not at all saying that it's like a thing that makes you trans in the way that I'm sure people sort of take this discussion, because inevitably that sort of gets, the nuance here gets lost. But it is a fundamental disassociation and a fundamental relationship to an avatar and to a body that you're not as the source of your of what sexuality means as your initial education to what sexuality is for, what you are for, what the genitalia are for. Now it's true that in our contemporary society, trans activists and I wouldn't even want to say trans activists because that's saying I know more than I do. I don't. I think it's probably just people who can see what makes money and are introducing deliberately gender dysphoric identifications into pornography. I think it's probably done under the sort of auspices of like equality and of, making pornography something that's, available to trans kids as well. I mean, this is not I would imagine that there's few people who are doing this I don't know, it's porn, so they could be very nefarious or something. But the point is that it's true, and it's been reported on in the media that there's deliberate efforts to gender bend pornography in some way so that people who are watching, I guess, again, quote unquote, heterosexual pornography, which we'll talk a little more about, are introduced to the perspective of the other gender when they don't expect it. And as you might imagine, at least I saw the Daily Wire people talking about this, there's the critique that like they're trying to turn us trans. And I want to stop there for a moment because I'm sure that at some level that's true. But I think that it's probably an unhelpful route. So I was reading the book Females by Andrea Long. He was a guy and transitioned, and as Andrea was recounting in a, I think, fairly intelligent way, like what it meant to be female. It was odd. I don't think it's correct. He basically had a Aristotelian version of it where the female is the sort of
not male,
the not male passivity in all of us, and we're all already female because of this. And so transgenderism is sort of an honesty or an authenticity to the sort of universal,
the universal feminine.
You're
in
all
of us.
just the objects of somebody's desire. We're all just passive slaves to it, and so
that's so cynical.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. But so giving this narrative, he mentioned the use of what's called sissy porn. Again, I can only go off what I read in the book here because I can't exactly like research this online or something for obvious reasons. But it's basically a very deliberate adding trans perspectives to quote unquote heterosexual pornography. Porn. So you're exposed to something that is part of your pornographic addiction, but there's text that's suggesting that the man is really a woman who's changed her identity to that of a man, or that the thing. So
it is heterosexual porn, but then you're just told, well, it's actually not.
Yes, it's overlaid.
These characters are different.
It's overlaid with a sort of fiat. And Andrew was saying that was extremely arousing, and it was a big part of like that whole experience. And other people have said the same. That exposure to those kinds of pornography did introduce the question of maybe I am in fact a woman, maybe I am in fact female.
Right, because you do have an experience of like, well, this is working.
Right.
And that, I mean, that's hard to deny.
Sure. Like what works, especially once sex and gender have been reduced to sort of pleasure and the organs of pleasure apart from any question of nature, apart from any question of babies,
or just like the simple like gift of self.
Yes.
To the other. I mean, that's certainly not what's happening in porn.
We certainly live in a world in which what causes sexual pleasure has been just violently associated with identity, so that what you feel within your genital sort of immediate experience indicates really strongly who you are inside.
Right. Yeah.
There's a lot of reasons for this. I think they're all bad reasons. But because of this, it can be very effective to a person who's asking the question, who I am inside, to associate with their genital pleasure a particular perspective, and especially in this case, of the opposite sex. So,
right. Again, especially if your education of sex and sexual identity is coming through a screen and not an actual experience with another person.
Oh, totally.
I mean, I think we've kind of talked about it before, but I think it's helpful to remember that, like, the way that we, like, come into our sexual identity is, like, primarily through two ways. Like, one is, like, through, like, the group of your gender.
Yeah.
Like, you are raised into womanhood through other women. And
well, you were.
Yeah. Like, you have, like, a world of women. Like, you have, like, a work that you are doing together. Yeah. And same with men. And so you learn, I mean, I still think this is true. Like everyone knows that only a man can teach a man to be a man.
Sure.
Really. And I think the same thing is true for women. But as those worlds have been kind of, like, shattered and everything has become more unisex, and that kind of education, natural education that we would have had becomes more and more inaccessible.
Yeah.
So we don't have that so much anymore. And then the other way that, like, we really experience ourselves as being masculine or feminine is when the other sex draws that out of us. Mm-hmm. Whether it's in, like, a romantic situation or not, like, certain elements of, like, my femininity just, like, aren't drawn out of me from my other female friends.
Totally.
And that really only happens, I think, effectively with real people with whom you have an actual relationship. And you can't obtain that same effect through a screen. So you've kind of lost, like, sexual identification, like that kind of education. You don't have that among, like, a group of men or women. Mm-hmm. And then you have this, like, loss of the actual other person who ought to bring this out of you. And you're just learning about your sexual identity through this third-party experience. Yeah,
and I think what happens, especially in male groups, is that pornography becomes this sort of ritualized coming-of-age ceremony that is lacking within a...
that makes so much sense,
with our culture. And so what you end up doing is you end up exposing... because everyone has to overcome a certain guilt and disgust when they watch pornography.
And part of that really is introducing people into your own sin, initiating people into the sin.
Exactly. And the need to initiate them into it is present precisely to the degree that there's the remaining guilt of it. Because what it says is, if I can get you involved, then this is something that everybody does. And I can bring you up into it, and it's part of the natural course of things, and you're a little bit deviant and probably gay if you're not into this. And so what you have is this within the teenage years, because of essentially the breakdown of the family as a real source of authority, where fathers bring sons up into a male world, and not just fathers, but father figures generally, like masters, older men having a world with which to share with children. We don't really have that. And so what happens is the teen peer group sort of takes it on themselves, and pornography is increasingly the sort of locus of that ritual, where
it is kind of performative. Like, this is like the ritual in which we engage in order to affirm our masculinity to ourselves and to our peer group.
Well, and shame is a very social feeling. So what I mean is, like, on the one hand, it's not like you feel terrible, you feel ashamed, but on the other hand, to be united with someone in shame is a sort of conspiracy.
There's a real unity that's there. Like,
right, because you can't tell on the other person, and that person can't tell on you, because you're both involved in the same sin. Mm-hmm. And that inviting people into sin has the sort of effect of producing a faux community. It's like, normally community is bound together. I shouldn't say normally, ideally, as I don't know what's normal. But ideally, community is bound together by common loves. So when Augustine looks at what makes a people, he says, what do they love? This love is what brings them together. Now, in an age of heightened individualism, the entire ethos of the culture and obviously all of the technologies that we're involved in that alienate us and make us lonely and individuate us and lock us in our rooms. But the entire ethos of the culture is that you're an individual and you've got your desires and you do what you want. And authenticity means to follow that dream wherever it goes, which means you're lonely all your life because you never join something that is common. There's no common good. There's your good, there's his good, there's her really special princess good, and you're really special. You're going to be a YouTuber boy good. I don't know. But you have all these individual goods, and the point of liberalism is to destroy the church by saying, don't worry, there is no common good. There is no one thing we should all be doing.
It's just whatever.
Everyone's
works
free
for
to
you.
do whatever. And the only thing we can imagine as tyranny is someone who says, hey, there's one thing we should do together. And suddenly it's like, that's the wickedness. That's the fascism. That's the evil. We're supposed to avoid this. And we're supposed to maintain just individual goods. But then there's a real loss to our humanity. So we're all growing up and we're all built essentially by nature to belong together in one common thing. Then we don't have it and we're denied it. The teenage peer group steps in and says, you can belong to one thing, but it does it artificially through a common conspiracy of shame.
Yeah.
So in pornography, you have a certain ritual by which you join what everyone's doing and no one's doing.
Yeah.
You're all in
Everyone's
denial.
doing, no one's
all...
talking about.
Exactly. And so it actually, I think, has, especially at that young age, now as it becomes an addiction, as it becomes really just a part of developing sexuality, I think it loses this initial sort of oddly communal and ritualistic aspect because it becomes such a crisis in the individual's life. But I think it's important to remember that at the beginning, it's an introduction from a quasi-adult world to a child's world.
Right.
And it's a breaking of innocence and a creation of a new and perverse bond of fraternity where you now belong to this other group of people who have seen.
Right.
Right.
Oh,
There's
yeah,
a Gnostic
that's very
element to it. And that is obviously horrid. I mean, it's like the worst person in the world. And, like the one who not the one who does that, because I understand we're operating with sin and temptation and forces, but the one who insinuates that this is natural and this is the way things go.
Yeah.
I find it very frustrating. But okay, so the point that I wanted to just clarify is, yes, it is true that within this world of sort of universalized addiction that we don't talk about, it is true that trans activists and just market forces are making particularly trans pornography. And in such a way as not just to be like, and here's this other identity option, which we're certainly doing. I mean, if it exists, there's porn of it, right? That's the idea. But also to interrupt and disrupt sort of normal heterosexual pornography with something that switches a perspective and allows or forces in some way the identification with the opposite sex.
I wonder too if that same kind of dynamic is going on. Like maybe it's not just like like a bunch of people sitting around a table like, so how do we make people trans?
Yeah,
like it's just I mean, if you're already in this world, like you want to initiate people into your world. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a pretty universal human desire. Like that's a pretty strong desire of adults. Like we long to like initiate children into adulthood. I mean, there is like a thrill of like teaching a kid something, or like taking like a teenager and teaching them like, here's how you would deal with these like adult real world problems that you don't know how to handle. And I think part of it is kind of like a power trip. And the more cynical view, and I think the more positive sense is like, this is what we're supposed to do. Like there is something like very exciting, like I'm really helping you. I'm really like initiating you and bringing you into a new world. And so I think that kind of dynamic is at play with pornography, but there's that element of shame, and I could see even with like trans pornography, or just the transgender movement in general. Like why is there so much force behind this? Like this desire to initiate people into this world in which I belong.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it is, of course, yeah, it's totally natural. Like we are, even despite our best efforts, fathers and mothers to others, and we bring them and we raise them up. And that is precisely what's being corrupted, is that dynamic. I think it's probably a tiered hierarchy of intentions here at the top. I'm sure there are probably people that are like, yeah, I just want to make the kids trans.
Yeah.
But I think there's also an effect that, and we all do this in most sins, which is that the child is a sign of nature to us, is a sign of innocence. And so to have a child do something implicitly absolves us of sin, because if it can belong,
if it belongs to the world of the child, then it's natural in my world, and it shouldn't make me feel guilty about it.
So I think, and when I say we all do this, I mean, like, I've seen this done in ways that are more and less troubling. I'm not trying to make what's the word? I'm not trying to make a chart of which is the worst, but I remember seeing, I remember being troubled at pro-life rallies. So I'm involved in pro-life work. So I'm very often at things where people are being loudly and proudly pro-life in defense of the unborn. And I'm sure you've seen this too, and it's always well-meaning. And so I hate to make this like the object of the critique, but you get a T-shirt that's like, sized for a 2-year-old, and it says something like, "When I grow up, I'm voting pro-life." And you give a kid a sign that says some political statement that they can't possipossibly comprehend the fullness of, but they have a basic
just like, I get to hold the sign.
The kid holds the sign, and they're like, "Yeah, I remember." I remember a friend, and I still love these signs. It was great. Bill Clinton was visiting, and there was like a 4-year-old kid with a sign that just said, "Get the scum out of here."
It's very funny.
No, it's extremely humorous. But then you also see it on you see shirts that say things like "trans rights are human rights," and it's a 5-year-old kid wearing it. And
it's like, it's the same thing.
Obviously, the content is very different, but the dynamic is basically like, if a child says it, it has a certain imprimatur, right? Right. And we can't really get children to say it and to mean it, but we can sort of do certain things to suggest that our position here
is
or our
the position of the children. I mean, you see this. I can't remember when. This is probably still popular, but I remember running into videos of a number of children would be interviewed. It's like, well, so Fred and Thomas fall in love with each other. Yeah. What do you think about it? And the kid's just like, that's fine, or they can tell that they're being prompted to say something, and you could do the same thing with I mean, you could do the same thing with conservative kids. Is that weird to you? Does that make sense? I mean, you can just prompt the right answers, and those videos were see, even children get it. Yeah, even children understand. It's like, no, they don't.
No, children are dumb.
Using that from a conservative element too. Obviously, it's not convincing anyone. But I think you are right. If it belongs to the world of the child. Yeah. I think there is something certainly a lot more consistent, because I do think that pro-life just it sits well with children. I mean, children are excited about other children. They're excited about babies.
And if you really are honest about it, it doesn't take someone with a deeply developed conscience or thought to think that killing people is wrong, killing innocent people. And so it's not even that. That's why I was hesitant to not make a direct comparison, because it's not direct. But this idea, this need to have it come through the mouth of a child, I think is part of what we see in the trans emphasis on trans kids as the real sort of object of the sort of therapeutic, the victim that needs to be rescued is the child, essentially. And then
right. I mean, it makes sense. Why are we making sex education younger and younger? I mean, in part, I think it's a response to porn. But
Yeah,
like,
I mean-
why is it so exciting for adults to teach like kids like sex ed? I mean, you can you can feel like a real energy behind this, like an excitement. I think it's because of that like desire to like initiate the young into the adult world
and thereby cleanse the adult world. I think that's right. I remember the nurse from Planned Parenthood coming to our school and showing us how stretchy condoms were, and you know, we're young, we're very young. You know, in any public school is so hilarious because in any given situation where like if the exact same thing was done by a teacher who wasn't assigned to do that as their class, like that, oh my gosh, you would make so much money suing the school. But the moment it's like, well, it's health class, so now you've got a 45-year-old woman like stretching condoms over kids' hands. It's like,
this is fine.
Totally normal world. Moving on. But okay, so to sort of tie this all in together, which is hard. That idea that there's this thing that's called like pornography, and it's normal, and it's basically a heterosexual project. You know, boys do it, men do it, men sort of allow boys to do it. There's a permissiveness in it, and then you kind of join the man club by virtue of having seen it, and that's normal, good pornography. And then there's this bad thing that's all the woke stuff that's changing the pornography, and it's turning out the kids.
We want our traditional pornography back.
We're trads, man. Yeah, that's ludicrous. And what I think it really doesn't help us understand is how the disassociation with the body and the identification with the foreign body as the means and mode of sexual arousal is already present in quote-unquote heterosexual pornography.
Right. Or maybe
you're trained through the habitual watching and the gradual addiction that you develop to identify with the genitals of another person for the sake of your own sexual pleasure. Mm-hmm. And so your sexual pleasure becomes increasingly dependent on that other, who you're not, that other being present for you to identify with. The third person perspective becomes naturalized. That is the way that sex is felt. That is the way pleasure is produced, is by the adopting of a perspective of people with whom you are other to them and they are other to you.
Right.
And this dependence on an avatar body is why the increase in the pornography of our culture, the increased pornography use of our culture, has not led, as many conservatives thought it would, to a sort of rampant hedonism. What do I mean by that? I just mean that what's not happening is that people are sort of watching pornography more and more and then becoming more and more sexually either Don Juan-esque or just criminal in acting out what they see, et cetera, et cetera. Rather, we live in a very strange world in which you have, on the one hand, young people watching pornography, but not having sex, engaging in much fewer sexual behaviors with each other. And so you have also at the sort of height of pornography addiction, you don't have a sort of virile or like overcharged, oversexed reality. You have symptoms like erectile dysfunction, right. You have symptoms like performance anxiety, you have symptoms like premature ejaculation from males, all of which are, they make sense within pornography addiction, and which make the actual movement from the screen to reality to be scary and difficult.
Right.
So
right.
the dependence on an avatar body that characterize.
Well, basically, like you're creating a disposition of habitual dependence on like a screen, a third party, an avatar body, mm-hmm. And so the movement to like actually encountering another person is terrifying because you've come to your own education and sexual identity in a world in which is very safe.
Yeah.
In which you don't actually have to encounter the other person who should be the one who's bringing out your masculinity or femininity.
Yeah. I mean, sex isn't safe, and this pornography is extremely safe. I don't know if this is the time to. I think I would say there before we go down that road, there is an argument about novelty that's worth addressing here. This is just another one I've heard in terms of the connection between pornography and
right.
And I think there's some credence to it, so I want to make sure it's said, which is that basically as a pornography addiction develops, it relies on the same patterns of any addiction, which is that you are essentially chasing dopamine hits, and the pornography is providing it, and it builds a physical pathway in the brain between the thing, pornography in this instance, and the pleasure. And so it creates a sort of line of conditioning.
Right.
And what this gradually does, though, is like any drug that induces the same thing, is it becomes less effective over time. So we get diminishing returns in pornography addiction. Eventually, you're getting less dopamine, in just experiencing less pleasure with the same object. And so there is a drive within pornography to always produce novelty,
right,
where the same can be presented as the different, and so be a new, exciting object. And so it's true that pornography addiction tracks very well with just like growing perversity in it. And part of this is like
in order to get the same dopamine hit, it has to be more and more transgressive.
Yeah. And I think it's true, but it's also important to realize like it's not just novelty for its own sake. It's like novelty that does increase the violence of it, the sense of it as as something powerful and something that hurts other people in some way. What I mean is like it's not like the pathway of growing sexual perversion is that like everyone wears different colored clothes each time. It's like like the trajectory is clearly towards ultimately the destruction of the woman. Usually that's ultimately the tendency of pornography is to murderous depictions, towards rape and towards violence and towards these other things. So it's not sufficient to just say, okay, well, we desire novelty, and so at a certain point of addiction, you just start watching trans pornography because...
Right, it's not the slippery slope argument.
Yeah, because you just needed something novel. So I don't think that's quite it. But I do think that it is true that, like any addiction, the search quickly dries up. Like there's no fruit from it. So it does have people who are addicted looking for something, for something new, and for something that can affect them. And so it kind of goes back to your argument where it's like, well, if that's the case, then insofar as anything like sissy porn works, then it works. But the question we have to remember is, but why do we make a movement from just pure novelty to questions of identity, questions of who I am? That I'm aroused by watching this versus that. Suddenly I am a woman versus a man. That's sort of what I want to maintain in our thought. Yeah. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's where kind of the whole, the thing that we're trying to do in this series is to try to see like how have our habits and interior dispositions been shaped.
Yeah.
And so this is just one element. Like we know how addictions work. We know like how we're being educated into our sexual identity.
Yep.
We live in a consumerist culture where like I decide and buy my identity. And it in many ways kind of is a performance. Like it's something that has to be shown, just like all these different cultural factors that are changing the way that we come to our identity, so that when you have like a real brokenness or real like questions like entering the picture, so like pornography is already the way that I come to know my sexual identity.
Yeah.
And then if I'm like out in the real world and I have this experience of I don't identify with other men. I don't feel like a man, which seems like generally like a average crisis. Or like I don't identify with other women, or I'm not like successful in dating or whatever like your experiences is, like out in like your actual reality, then it kind of makes sense for you to start searching in different places in pornography, because that's what we're already kind of doing. Yeah. And it's not like everyone is going to go that same pathway, but if you have like experiences out in the real world that seem to be pointing you in a certain direction, then this is also the direction that you're going to go in pornography. Sorry.
It's good. Just worried for Alex's sake. The microphones.
Sorry, Alex.
Yeah, I think that's true. And there's this sort of very weird confluence of two movements here where the sexual is being reduced to the external and the biological on the one hand as a sort of conservative, scientific,
like functional
proposition, and that's been happening for like the last 100 years, even more than that. But and then you have the various
identity,
crises,
meaning.
So my point is simply that pornography on its own really probably wouldn't have the potency it has if it wasn't for the kind of society that we live in to answer questions of meaning, right? Because if you're saying, look, I know what it is to be a man, it is to be involved with these people in this work, and it has a profundity to it, and that profundity is something that I learn, I face a mystery and I learn through my entire life, and that guides you, then pornography, well, of course, it's a temptation. The idea that it would provide, that identifying with the genitals of another man would somehow provide
how I affirm my masculinity.
Answer. Yeah, it wouldn't. I just don't think it would really make sense. And in fact, historically, it just doesn't really seem to be the case that people are finding that kind of meaning in pornography. So our age is very unique for several reasons that we'll mention. But one to point out here is that biological external view of sex, which just reduces it to function, does have the effect of saying that what you can see the genitals doing, like what's visible in the sexual act, is really the
identity,
the everything that you need to know about what makes a man a man. I mean, if you think about the logical consequence of saying we referred to it as the just look down,
yes,
right? So the logical consequence is, if I can know everything I need to know about who I am by just looking down at my genitals, then in seeing genitals on a screen and identifying with them, I am somehow involved in the totality of the education necessary for being a man, or at least being that man. So it's perverse, but you can see why those two things operate in concert. The sort of medicalization and reduction of sex to its function.
Functions, yeah.
And then its function, of course, is totally reduced to simply pleasure. And then we have the question of, who am I? What does it mean to be a man, et cetera, et cetera? And it's like, well, that's all there is.
Yeah.
It's all there. Just look down. It's just that we're looking at somebody else. But I think that before we go deeper into, I think, what that all looks like, there's two things I want to note. I just want to note how pornography is a certain like crown of a general cultural movement to help us understand it as a habituation of the human heart towards the apparent reasonableness of transgender proposition. In pornography, in developing a pornography addiction, you, as we've said, come to rely on essentially a performer. You come to rely on an avatar body, but it's not just an avatar body. It's not just like some sort of fantastic identification to no one in particular. It's a usually paid pornographic actor, and one who presents himself, to speak from the male perspective here, as the expert,
right?
Right. So that, because they're in a sort of master position, and you're identifying with them, right? So it's in a sense, it's taking over a very basic faculty we all have. Like we all look to people wiser than us and older than us and stronger than us and try to identify them, not this sort of weird pornographic thing we're talking about where we're just sort of like literally imagining ourselves as them, but we do look to them and try to be like them. That's the normal way of development. And so the introduction of universalized pornography is simultaneous with a complete insecurity about having sex, having sexuality as something we own and that we can have in freedom and that we can offer as a gift and that can come from us. It becomes, again, for that first 4 to 8 years of our sexual education, it's repeated to us again and again that this is a kind of act that other people do really well.
Yeah,
and
like
so
this
when sex
it belongs
comes,
to the experts.
Yes.
It belongs to the performers.
Yeah,
And
the stars.
so,
even.
yes,
you want to emulate the stars, and so that when sex becomes real, when it becomes a genuine reality, you can see why performance anxiety is one of the symptoms of pornography addiction. It's not simply, we can describe the brain patterns and such, but fundamentally, we have engaged in and entered in and solidified a relationship of the ignorant to the expert. Now, it's a lie. It is poor. They're not experts. What they're doing is scarcely sex. It's something, and it's manipulated to look like, an unrealistic version of what's possible. But
yeah, I mean, I think that's like you're also being educated into something that is not normal, is not
true.
possible.
I remember reading this, and forgive me, I don't have a source for this. It just strikes me that it's just very, it's just so, what's the word? Characteristic of our world that, you can listen to this and you can think, well, this is like good versus evil, bad porn stars versus good, kids who are just trying to make it through the world. But it's just never that simple, especially in America where sex and Christianity are always both operative. I just remember reading this story of porn stars who had a crisis of conscience that all this porn they were producing was producing unrealistic expectations in people about how sex should work and how their love lives should work. And so what they did, if I have this right, was they produced pornography of themselves, but not as porn actors, but just a camera of them having sex because of the sympathy of their hearts to say no, it's not really like that. You should know that it's really funny. Like this, where it's, it's sort of more, less frills or whatever. I just bring this up because it's sort of comical, but it does, but it does show that we're not. Yeah, well, maybe it just shows that we're nuts, but we're a Christian kind of nuts at the end of the day.
Well, I'm glad they were sympathetic.
Yeah. I mean, there's something there.
Looking out for the little guy.
Yeah. So we should see pornography, I think, as the end result of a movement that really has been going on for the last 200 years or so, and it takes a certain real peak in the 1920s and 1930s, and it's referred to sociologists as the rise of the helping professions. And I've been reading Christopher Lasch. He's just absolutely my guy these days.
Yeah.
And
he's great.
He describes it pretty simply, and I think we can all see it without a degree in anything. It's just the family is increasingly deemed incompetent. So that is to say, the child in relationship to the father and the mother, who are related to each other as husband and wife. This form
unit,
is deemed incompetent to do something called the reproduction of culture, social reproduction. And all that means is that our society, which exists in people, is reproduced in the next generation. So the rise of the modern nation state is characterized by a increasing alarm at the idea that the reproduction of the culture of that nation state is left into the hands of moms and dads who cannot be observed and who are probably dumb, And so increasingly,
the sheeple,
yes, they come under the scrutiny of the helping profession. So these are the psychiatrists and then the therapists. These are the various government institutions that can take your kid technically, but they don't like to. And generally speaking, the public school system itself where the various roles of the family and society in raising children are, as much as possible, taken, exported to experts who then not only do they have a certain expertise at doing what they do, but they also now have a job, which within a cash nexus economy now means they have an independent reason to assert their own expertise constantly against the family, because the one thing a guy with a job knows is that he needs to prove that it matters.
Yes.
And the family is especially prone to doing things that suggest that whole swaths of our economy don't matter and don't need to exist, and we could just save a bunch of money by not doing them. Like homeschooling, for instance, is an obvious example. It's not the topic of our discussion, so I won't go down that road, but it's just obvious to people who look at it that schooling generally is a very modern invention. It's something
public schools,
but also just compulsory and sort of the degree of state education. It was designed sort of with industrialism, especially in England, specifically to
good workers, to educate their people, to instill good virtues.
Yeah, and to acclimate children to essentially doing just one thing all day, because that's what they are now going to be doing as industrial workers. No, it's true. It's really in there. It's like you got to read. I'll try to provide a link here. E.P. Thompson has a good essay on this. But so I'm going to read some Lash here just so you can sort of see in his words what has been happening in terms of the increasing deemed incompetence of the family, and then the helping professions rising up to take things that were previously the responsibility of fathers and mothers, husbands and wives, including, just to look out for it, sex, and making them the object of professional scrutiny that have now markers of success that aren't simply judged between people, but are in fact judged by science. Okay, so in the 1920s, the first results of the combined attack on the old style family began to come into view. The rise of the flapper, the revolt of youth, the revolution in manners and morals. At the time, many observers saw in these developments the complete collapse of public order, but in retrospect, it is clear that they merely facilitated the incorporation of women and youth into the market as full-fledged consumers, perpetually restless and dissatisfied. The combined influence of advertising and the helping professions had liberated people from old constrictions within the family, within religion especially, only to expose them to more subtle forms of control. These new agencies freed personal life from the repressive scrutiny of church and state, only to subject it to medical and psychiatric scrutiny or to the manipulation of the advertising industry. Insisting on the privacy of sex and marriage, they gave the most intimate acts unprecedented publicity. Upholding the family as the last stronghold of spontaneity, they sought to expel from marriage, love, and sex precisely the irregular, the unpredictable, the unmanageable. The repeal of reticence. We're going to talk about it all. We're going to talk about sex. Lifted the shroud of sexual ignorance, but imposed the new constraint of an allegedly scientific technique, in the light of which sexual performance, which is the first time that the word performance has been used, he notes, in the light of which sexual performance would be judged and usually found wanting. Lawgiver and priest retired from sexual supervision only to make way for the doctor, whose supervision was far more thorough. The older authorities had proscribed acts that threatened the stability of the community. The rest they left to discretion. Doctors, on the other hand, sought to shore up the psychic stability of the individual and therefore omitted nothing from their gaze. The disenchantment of erotic life dispelled many superstitions, but reduced it to routine. The establishment of medical and industrial jurisdiction over marriage thus defeated its own purpose, to strengthen the last bastion of privacy. So I should have said before reading that he's saying it is a self-defeating enterprise. So he's not questioning that people wanted to do things like strengthen marriage and help families, etc. But the way that we've increasingly done it is by helping families by deeming them incompetent in their sphere and introducing the relationship of expert to the ignorant as the basic way that a society reproduces itself.
So maybe another way of thinking of it is the more you become dependent on an expert, like it opens up a world of possible failure for you.
Totally, yeah.
Like instead of like sex just belonging to, like, this is just like the human experience.
Yeah.
And we learn from experience, and then we learn from like our friends and intimate relations if like things are going wrong.
Yeah.
Like I can always like go to pornography for like the expert perspective. And so now I have this new way of failing, or even like the sex experts trying to like help marriages or therapists.
It's paradoxically true that as we become less and less able to do anything of our own resources, that we do become more and more deranged. And in need of therapy and in
like
need of...
The more we become dependent on those things, the more we actually do become dependent on those things.
That's right.
So like I was going to kind of back up and say like, those things really are helpful and are necessary, but maybe it wasn't always so necessary, except in our society.
That's certainly Lash's argument that there's always sin and there's always disappointment in things sexual, of course, but that without really noticeably like improving everyone's sexual lives so everyone's satisfied, and without derangement and without neurosis and without hang-ups, the professional help has become a norm of our society, like without proven results, basically. And it's particularly obvious.
And it can, if you are a parent and it becomes normal to like go to experts and to go to therapists. I was watching an interview recently on like essentially you're kind of like creating a neurotic generation where like if your child isn't progressing or developing according to the books, according to what the scientific expectation is, according to what the normative expectation is, and something is going wrong and I need to go to the expert, where it could just be your kid and it takes your kid a little bit longer to read and it's fine.
Sure.
Or it takes like your kid a little bit longer to like regulate his emotions and it's fine.
Lash writes about that as well, that this is also the age in which like there's manuals for everything, and so parenting becomes something that he points out that the manualists are basically saying, trust your instincts, but here's 300 pages on what your instincts should really be showing you to do. It does create a sense of that basically the norm without expert guidance is that you mess up your kids, you mess up your marriage, and so you're basically incompetent, and so it's necessary to have helping professions within society to sort of shore you up as an individual. And I want to point out that when it comes to sex especially, this is very weird. I mean, you think about the Catholic ethic here, what it would actually involve where it lived. You would have a virgin marry a virgin. So you would have a man who has no direct experience of the sexual relationship marry a woman with no direct experience of sexual relationship. Of course there's wisdom, of course there's discussions, but they fundamentally come to each other as amateurs, which is the word for lovers, and in that there's no point of really comparison, right. So that your sexual experience is essentially judged in and of itself. It's like, right. If it sucks, it sucks, but it sucks because of what you guys are doing together, not because of this knowledge of a perfect form of sex that you should be having that you're failing to have. Mm-hmm. I remember talking to a sexologist a couple years ago who, I forget the number, I'm going to screw it up, but she said one of the problems men have is they don't realize that the female clitoris has like 300 moving parts to it. And this was like, so this knowledge, which was known to sexology, is not known to men in marriages. And because of this, men are failing to please women. And it just struck me as like so horrid, like insinuating the necessity for like, oh, thank goodness sexologist came here. Thousands of years of just not knowing how many moving parts there were just absolutely debilitated marriages. I can't believe anyone ever reproduced ever. Like the overwhelming evidence of the fact that humanity is still here and that children are still raised and that generally speaking parents are fond of children and children are fond of their parents is that social reproduction can happen through the family.
Right. It doesn't have to rely on an expert class.
Right. So when I say that pornography is a sort of crown on a general social mode, I'm not saying that. I mean, okay, there is a really crude version of this in which pornography just becomes a literal ideal, in which married couples need to have pornography and watch pornography in order to enjoy sex in marriage. This is true. This happens. I don't know numbers. I just know it happens. And it's also true on a very crude level that men, especially, act out what they see in pornography as a sort of ideal. I mean, what do you expect? They look at this for 8 years and then they find a woman and she agrees to marry them and they try to do what they've just been taught to do for 8 years. Generally speaking, women don't like it. And that becomes sometimes I think the first real inkling that what was taught was a lie. But the relationship to an expert is not usually just didactic. It's not usually simply saying, okay, I'm going to go to porn to think about what I should do in real life. I think it's usually more subtle and insinuating than that. It just says that you're not good at what you do. Right. It just says you aren't the star. It just says that you are essentially inadequate.
It just sets you up for the expectation of failure,
and
I think.
It's a million expectations of what you should be doing. Whereas chastity and fidelity set you up with absolutely zero expectations. Now, that being said, of course, we come from the girls and the boys, right? So it's not the case that this is some sort of, people who valorize frankness about speaking about matters of sex and just saying like, this is the position you should take and this is what you should do and here's the statistics and here's the science. What they tend to do is pretend that there was no mechanism whatsoever prior to themselves for talking about disappointment and success within a sexual life.
Right.
So it's just like, wow, what did we do before sexology came? But obviously, you talk with other married couples, and not as couples, but within single-sex groups, and you can see how in a world in which women really do have a world of work, a conversation, which later becomes characterized as gossip, but really is a unique form of language, and as men have the same, that knowledge and wisdom and help can be found.
Right. Those conversations happen, but they happen like among the men, among the women.
Yeah. And it's
I think about I liked what you were saying earlier when we were discussing this, like the advice, like thinking about the advice that you get from pornography versus the advice that you'd get from like as a woman from other women about your real experiences, just a lot more human because it's. I mean, like, obviously, like, there is concern about technique, but there's not so much a concern about technique as in, like, here's how you be patient with the other person. Sure. Like, here's how you engage this person as a person. Yeah. There's that additional element that's kind of lost in pornography, lost in, like, sex experts. It becomes more of a technical function.
Yeah, and there's no humanity to admitting that it can suck. Like, it'd be lame.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you have, when the whole sex ed thing is that there's, like, a theoretical perfection that we can all achieve if we just take the classes and get the parts right and buy the right things, use the right contraception, right toys, whatever it is. Like, there's a whole massive industrial agency for you getting what you really deserve. It's incredible how hard nature is to achieve when you're in a society like ours. But yeah, a lot of money and a lot of study, and you can really actually have sex. But you look at like any kind of traditional, I mean, I get this mostly from novels and literature, but it seems like prior to this, the advice is more like, it's going to be bad at first, but stick with it. Like it's going to be sort of surprising. You know what I mean? There's a sort of pessimism that's natural to human culture that says, look, lover boy, lower your expectations, and then wisdom comes in from your own group. And yeah, I don't know. It just seems like that seems like what we need these days,
right.
But we can only read it because of our culture as somehow like repressive and demoralizing, as if people shouldn't have heard that. They should have heard things like, it's the most beautiful, profound experience. And if you're not having that, like, you can fix it by buying, whatever. So that relationship that pornography sort of inaugurates and forms. So we are a pornographic age. Our education is pornographic. So our approach to our own sexuality is one of inadequacy and in need of help, in need of the helping professions, and the need of the expertise of that pornography is essentially the image of.
Or even possibly like the third party in order to experience natural arousal.
Right, exactly. And so within this, it becomes, I think, at least reasonable to start. It's reasonable to start seeing how a pornographic culture would just be more primed to receive transgender propositions as being plausible.
Right.
It's like, okay, if it's the case that everything I need to know about sex is all just genital pleasure, etc., and all the experts know about how to get genital pleasure, and I've spent the last 8 years watching experts produce genital pleasure and identifying with them, then it seems to fit right in with our entire society that we also need to essentially doubt the body as it's been given. So doubt that the fact that we have a male body means like that we could be wrong. That could be a failure actually, because the way you have sex is probably a failure. So why not your sex entirely? That sort of identification, I think, becomes more plausible within a pornographic world. But I think
right, and also learning your sexual identity from what gives you pleasure and arousal. I mean, that especially when we were talking about like kind of like initiating like young men into adulthood through pornography, and that you confirm your male identity by this like third party way of becoming aroused. If this is just kind of the way that we confirm masculinity, it would make sense that this would become the way that we confirm sexual identity in other ways, even if it's like a transgressive way. Well, like I'm now finding myself like aroused or intrigued by imagining myself as the opposite sex, and this is just what we do as a culture to confirm our sexual identity. And so like my identity must come from like this like third party experience, which is just kind of what everyone is doing. I just happen to be going a different route. No, the like pornography is already trans in the sense that you are not irrelevant. You really aren't. You're alienated, and I do think that there is a reason why we tie sexual pleasure with identity. It's not, I mean, there certainly it's been grotesquely sort of enlarged in our age that you feel something and then you have this like irrevocable identity. I think people like Foucault have made fun of this tendency in modernity. I don't need to repeat that. But that being said, what sexual arousal is really fascinating, and it's not the same as pornographic arousal. And that's that lie that I was sort of alluding to that, takes a while to be revealed within a pornographic culture. But the way sexual arousal works is that you find joy in the joy of the other. And this is, I think, romantic love and sexual love generally. So I think that it's not limited to sort of genital action. In fact, I think the limitation of it to genital action is sort of I
what is
remember
pornographic.
when we were talking about this earlier, like I coming to that realization in a Nature of Love class that I was taking like 5 years ago or whenever that was. But like love isn't just this, what's the word? When like you just are generous without any concern for yourself.
Altruism.
Yeah, altruism.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a critique of altruism, and like if you were actually looking at the nature of love, like there is something like if you are loving someone just for the sake of loving them, you're not giving that person the total experience of being loved, because part of that involves like delighting in them and delighting in giving them love, and then delighting in the fact that they're delighted that you have given them love. And so it does kind of create like this cyclical movement. I mean, I think that is what characterizes love, is that it's not stagnant, like it reproduces itself even with the experience of falling in love. Like falling in love isn't exciting except for the fact that like this other person delights in the fact that I delight in them.
And it mirrors and repeats. I think about holding hands. It's just sort of the typical, that's the first thing you do in the movie theater or whatever. It's been a while. I don't know. There's no more movie theaters, so it's irrelevant. But anyways, you find a dark room. And so the hands touch. And now what's so amazing about Eros, about the erotic, is that you are touching someone, and your delight is that you feel them touching you. But you can feel them touching you as they're being touched by you. And the delight is that they delight in your touch. Which is why it's always a very scary thing, because what if your hands touch and then you can tell by her hand that she does not delight in the feeling of your touch? It's not true that you can have love on one side. Like, well, I delight in touching this hand. No, that's horror. When the hand is clammy and scary and doesn't like you, then you cannot possibly enjoy the feeling of it, not erotically. And so what's required for the handhold to work and for love generally to work is that the touch is involved in sort of an infinite motion, in which I feel you touching me, feeling me touching you, feeling you touching me. It like you say, circulates and creates, as you can, I think, see, like a sort of a priority of what the other person is actually experiencing, a priority of their delight. And this is really important because people miss this because we have this moronic philosophy of liberal individualism where we're apparently all seeking our own pleasure. And you can kind of listen to that and be like, well, yeah, I mean, I guess I do things because I like to do things, sure. But it becomes so weird the moment you talk about anything sexual, because it's like, well, but what I want is for that other person to delight. What I want is for that person to rejoice. I want them to feel something. So yeah, in a way, I'm after my own desire, but my desire is for them to desire me, to desire them, to desire me. And immediately you get into this refractory sort of, and that's the beauty of it. It's beautiful to touch infinity within the finite. And sexual desire reveals, I think it really is beautiful, even though it's so fraught and so it can be so hard to see. But I think we are after that sort of communion, which has a boundless abundance to it, because you can always delight once more within that logic. And you can see why sexual love and the erotic tends towards ecstasy, from ecstasis, to be outside yourself. Is that because the other has a certain priority, that their joy has become your joy. It's not a dissociative ecstasy. It's a paradox that John Paul is very famous for pointing out, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but like the idea that like you only find yourself in the sincere gift of self. That's pretty good. Something very, very close to that. But it makes. I mean that is human love. Is a sincere gift of oneself, and you lose yourself, not in the sense that you disassociate from yourself. It's not, like there can be such a cynical way of like seeking like ecstasy so I can escape
my experience. But it is true that like in forgetting yourself, in loving the other, and giving yourself as a true and authentic gift to the other, that you do receive yourself back. And it seems like that is the way that we are supposed to come to our identity just as human persons in general.
Yeah.
In particular, our sexual identity.
Yeah.
And that kind of notion even, it makes so much sense for the religious as well. Like you can come into like a full like sexual identity, like as a woman or as a man in religious life too, because what you're doing is giving a full and sincere and total gift of self,
totally.
In which you receive yourself back. Totally. I mean, that is the trajectory, I think, of human love, and how it like moves us out of ourselves and really to the divine. So like,
it's fruitful, right? So it's not like okay, I mean, this is why the logic of reproduction, I shouldn't say reproduction, but of procreation, of bearing fruit in and through sexual love, it doesn't make any sense if sexual pleasure is somehow an individual desire that you go find fulfillment for in the other person. But if it's this sort of infinite reciprocity, then it bearing fruit makes a sort of metaphysical sense.
Yeah,
I guess
yeah.
it's like if you're rejoicing in the other's joy, then you're constantly trying to, for your own sake, you're constantly trying to serve the other. So the fact is that both people
receive the other person, and also like to give even more.
And both people are surpassed in a sense by their own love, because it's always a sort of game almost of mutual subordination, where you have each person taking the other's joy as their own. And so ultimately they are, they're losing themselves, and then finding themselves, but precisely as the object of the other person,
right?
As the object of the other person's joy, which is why, when we begun this, this whole podcast, one of the things we wanted to emphasize is that marriage has been traditionally considered the place in which gender is known. And this is sort of maybe a helpful way of looking at it, is that you cannot really receive a sexual identity as apart from a particular person whom you love and whom you devote yourself to this reciprocity. Like the idea of a sexual identity as being some static thing that you can name because it has a particular object is to simply talk about something besides sexual love properly.
Right.
What you're talking about is a sort of consumptive desire that you particularly have, and then you attain a certain relief when you are given the object of your consumptive desire, but it begins and ends with you.
Right, right, and we all know that's like that's a fake way of obtaining identity, like an identity that is really self-created in the end, we know is no identity at all. Yeah. Because it could always be fantasy. In the end, it's always my own construction. And so it would make sense that like really like to discover my sexual identity, like it can only take place in the context of a sincere gift of myself, because it's when I lose myself and give myself to the other that I actually receive something from the outside. Yeah. It's not something that I am constructing and building and obtaining and taking for myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is why, and it doesn't, it's just so cool, because in sexual love within marriage, you become a wife or you become a husband, and it's not this airy like question of, well, what do I like and what am I into? And it's objective. Yeah. It's like sexual love allowed to be what it is, creates objective identities. Like think about becoming a mother, that's the fruit of sexual love. It's not a crisis of identity. It's not like, I mean, it is now because of abortion, right? But like what I'm saying is, that gift of self is not this airy search for what pleases. It really has concrete results. It's really a decision to become someone. Yeah,
and so it's really like dissociative, I think, when you like engage in like now like a performance. Yeah. That is inherently identity conferring. Sure. And it's not done with a sincere gift of self of like wanting to give yourself totally to the other in a complete way, including your future, like whatever, all the theology, the body stuff. But when you're doing that, but withholding, and so like, this is how I'm supposed to receive my identity, but it's being withheld from me because I'm not actually giving myself to the act totally. Like that creates, I think, an interior crisis and confusion. Like you were saying, like this objectively makes you like husband and wife. So like to do that, but not to receive what that means.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. It's an identity creating power of the human person that we're literally contracepting, and then we're all wandering around asking like, how do I find my sexual identity? I better check my pornographic consumptive desires and see which one's pertinent right now. And it's like, dude, you don't have to. But I do think it's worth pointing out the reality here, which is that the genitals are symbols of this in a kind of primordial, or maybe just very important, let's say, way. So one of the things that's characteristic of sexual arousal, and I want to distinguish this from the pornographic, is that the sexual part comes to stand for the whole person. Because we speak of this like sex should be a total gift of self, and this is true, and it's not without its reality in the body. Like in sexual arousal, you identify yourself entirely in and through the union of what could be described as parts if you took a third person perspective. But the point is you don't. And so you're able to say things like you or me, like I blush to say it, but it's like, I want you inside me. I want to be inside you. The parts, that's an expression of very beautiful and healthy. I shouldn't say healthy, man. I'm so modern. It's awesome because there's a certain great triumph of love there, that the part has been totally lost in the gift, and so can function as the whole. It's incredible. I don't think you need to think too like genitally, I guess, to see it, because it's the same with touching, the same with the hand. Right. Like if I hold the hand of my wife, I touch her. And if she were to ever feel like my hand was touching her, then something horrible would have happened, right? Something would have been lost. And most likely it would be love that was lost. So you can see how if you're holding hands with someone and then you say something selfish, or you indicate in some way that you are not giving yourself to the other, that same hand can be holding that same hand, but it feels infinitely different, qualitatively different, because it no longer can be the person. Like you're no longer being touched by the person because the gift of the person is suspect. Instead, you're being touched by a hand. And being touched by a hand is the least erotic thing I can imagine, right? And this is true of our bodies and of just how we operate with each other in love. So pornography has this very pernicious effect where it's not doing something that's just completely absurd, that we're all raised up into sexual life by identifying with the genitals of another person. It is weird, but the thing it's corrupting, I think, is a real function of sexual love, which is to give ourselves entirely. And so the allowing someone else almost to do that for us and then to identify with them, I think is what creates just the fundamental separation of ourselves from our own sexuality and the reliance on experts that we discussed.
and then like you're kind of habituated into a thought that like that sexuality is a performance instead of a sincere gift of self. Whereas like, I don't know, like if you fail in like having sex, like you didn't fail in like giving yourself to the other person.
Right, sure.
And so there's something more like forgiving and even exciting about, I think, the whole journey that you get to go on together. Because it belongs to something beyond itself.
No, we live
Whereas in like the world of pornography, it's simply failure.
Totally.
It's simply failure.
And you see this in the kind of like especially in literature designed for children in public schools, especially, where they like lay out all the options of the LGBT plus acronym and all of the different possible identities, you have
Combos.
Yeah, and it's fun in the way that like Pokemon is fun, like to collect them all and all that. But there's this real what's the word here? I remember thinking this specifically about like the identity of asexual. So you find, like a 13, 14-year-old, 15-year-old kid identifying as asexual. And what's happened is that something has been irrevocably claimed as an identity on the basis of the question of sexual arousal. So if there is no sexual arousal in a given instance within certain parameters, then the person is asexual. So one whose sexual life involves a lack of arousal.
Right.
I mean, it gets sort of weird. I mean, it seems obvious that what we are about is trying to make things into identities, because if it all just comes from us, then sex is no longer an adventure, and it's no longer a relation with the other, because it's all there from the beginning. You have your identity, it's who you are, and then you act it out by finding the objects that are appropriate to your identity. You don't need other people for that, really,
right?
Except for insofar as they prove to be the particular objects of consumption. Now, this model, which certainly characterizes the LGBT plus model in its simplistic form, like find out your consumptive desire, and then we've got a name for it and a flag. So when you receive it, you'll be someone, you'll be the person, you'll be following your nature. There's a lot you could say about this. I mean, one of the things that's obvious is that by making something your nature, it totally eliminates the question of sin. Because if you're just doing what you do because you're an asexual, or because you're a pansexual or whatever, then the question of whether you ought to do it is sort of irrelevant. To be frustrated at a pansexual for doing pansexual things is like being frustrated at a frog for leaping on a lily pad or something like that. It's just the reduction of all sexual activities to the sort of emanations of particular identities is obviously such a guilt-ridden project of like, well, I did something, it's bad. I could say I could say that I'm bad, but I don't like that feeling, so I'm going to go ahead and say that I am an identity. I'm just doing me, baby. Every day I must do me. Because if I don't, it collapses. The whole thing collapses. But my point is just that model is the model of pornography. Because pornography is masturbation, right? Like we can talk about, yes, of course, you're identifying with the other, the body that you're not. You've created this total, very slavish sort of relationship of the ignorant to the one who knows, as the source of arousal. But in your actual act, you're involved in masturbation, which is something that pleases no one. So what I mean is, like, you don't please the person. So you don't experience sexual love, properly speaking. You don't experience something sexual. It's not a rejoicing in the joy that you produce in the other, which the joy is produced because you know what I'm saying? It is, the position of masturbation is that...
Like fundamentally sterile.
Yeah, because you are both the one who gives and receives, and so there is no giving and receiving. You are both the one who is active and passive, the male and the female. Like they are falsely, but symbolically contained.
You're a plant.
You're an androgen plant, yeah. And so that's what we've got. Just a lot of androgen plants identifying with porn stars. But, and it's normal, it's fine. It's a normal world. And nothing bad will happen, right? Okay, so this position of masturbation is a sort of enacting, a living out of the theoretical ideals of love within a liberal and individualistic society. I mean, that's just obvious, right? The idea that Christopher Lasch writes about is that gradually families come to be described not as anything done for motives of sacrifice or motives of the child, but something done to satisfy a desire. So you have something you want, and it's good for people to receive what they want, and your wife or your spouse has something they want. And what marriage is a getting together and both getting what you want. And so then a good reason to divorce is if one person says, I'm not getting what I want. And a good reason to stay together is, or a good way to stay together is to simply have sort of therapeutic communication about wants, and then make sure that everyone's getting
what they want.
Individual thing they want. And that gradually, as the helping professions continue to help, it starts to include the kids. So now the kids have what they want. And the family is essentially incidental to just this conglomerate of individuals who all have desires, and it's unjust not to satisfy them to the best of everyone's mutual ability. Which, like, man, if that's a family, why have one? But what that does to sex, when we live that out, is it doesn't distinguish sex from masturbation. Like, you are involved in a project of getting what you want. The other person's body happens to be the sort of means by which you get it.
Right,
but remember,
right.
in modernity, this body is contracepted. This body can undergo an abortion. And this body is framed as a way of getting an individual desire satisfied. And so even in, and I think we always tend to overcome this. This is obviously the bleakest possible picture of the whole that I could offer. But even in that, it has this influence of never leaving the kind of sexual education that pornography offers. So the other is very much kept at bay. And I think it's unfortunate.
Yeah. And I mean, it's obvious why there's so much stress and anxiety introduced into relationships, because suddenly if they're contractual, this person can leave if, like, I don't give them what they want. And I've learned that, like, sex is like something performative that I can fundamentally fail at. I mean, just that is a very anxious ridden way to live.
Totally. And it also, I think, helps to explain why, at least I, for one, see a connection between this education of pornography and the likelihood of transgenderism having a real truth to offer, which is that when we never leave masturbation as the form of sex, then we always contain both sexes, or our version of both sexes, within ourselves. So I don't want to be graphic, but for the masturbating person, it's like you are identifying with usually a man and a woman via avatar bodies. But in your response to that, you are acting out both parts of the ostensible sexual relation. So you are giving and receiving. You are the object and subject. And it doesn't take I think, too much of a stretch to imagine within that context where you never leave that, where you never become the one whose sole joy or whose greatest joy is the joy of the other. That's where the sexual breaks in and just ruins your life. And you never let that happen. You stick within the safety of pornography and masturbation, and then the people who are invited into that are in fact just means by which you perform it. When you maintain that, I don't see a particularly wild reason why you might not see in the opposite sex, in what they're experiencing, the greater portion of pleasure that you're performing on yourself. Like maybe if it's a sort of traditional sort of active, passive, giving, receiving identification that you're pornographically identifying with, and you're also performing on your own body, maybe as a man you are receiving more pleasure on the idea of receiving, or the fact of your masturbatory receiving, than you are of your masturbatory giving. And this seems to be the premise of things like sissy porn, where they are able to sort of speak by fiat a certain relationship to the masturbatory individual who can identify with that, who can see that as, oh, I can take that on. And they can take it on, obviously, because they already are.
Right.
Like, you can't just have pornography that someone's masturbating to and say, oh, like, you're the woman in this situation, if it's not already present in the act of masturbation itself. It seems to me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And I'm not saying, again, the difficulty of this is to is to avoid saying, okay, so this like turns the kids trans, and it's not quite it. It's just that you can see.
Well, it opens the door to like a real possibility. Like it expands the horizon of what is real. And so even if I might not walk through this door,
sure,
the door is open.
Yeah.
Because this is the way that we do sexuality. This is the way that I come to know my sexual identity.
And you can see how it's just it makes the goal of becoming the opposite sex doable by shifting the goalposts. So presumably it's very hard if you're a man to become a woman, but then when a woman is contracepted and just a visual object, a passive reception, then it does become a certain, like, especially if you never...
Yeah, if you reduce a woman, then it's a lot easier to become her.
Totally, yeah. And it seems like there's also a sort of... I mean, to me anyways, it makes sense that if we are stripped of a real ability to have identity, and if we're looking for identity in pornography, because of everything we've mentioned, because of the reduction to biology, because of the external nature of it, because of the peer group, etc. But if we're looking to pornography, it does seem that the opposite sex is always going to be better fit ultimately to our active identification. What do I mean by that? Because that sounds sort of paradoxical. What I mean is as a male, like, I don't experience maleness as an object because I am male. Like, I can think about it. I can like make my body a corpse and think about its parts and say that's male. But if you want to actually say the fullness of maleness, I don't have the ability to really articulate it and name it and dissect
you're already within it.
Because I am it.
Yeah.
So it's a subjective experience. Now, the female is mysterious to me, but does appear as a mysterious object because I have not, as it were, infected the object with my subjectivity. I will never be a woman. It is other to me. It is not me. And so in the same way that I stand before a woman as an object to a certain extent, she stands before me as an object. And so I think we can all grant that much. Then it seems like in pornography, once we are not simply identifying with the male, like if we really look to pornography to sort of give us I'm not putting it right. I'm saying that if we are trying to become an objective identity, if that's the goal, and we're not trying to do it subjectively, we're not trying to find it in giving ourselves and subjectively
right. So like
loving.
We're
just trying to find the thing we are, the scientific thing, and the way we do it is by finding out what arouses and
finding out what object do I identify with and experience
then
sexual
it seems like
arousal.
there's always going to be a certain, I don't know to call it a priority, but maybe it's a temptation that the other sex, precisely by virtue of their otherness, will appear as a more plausible object for us to identify with, because it's the only, like, the other sex is the object to us, and the same sex has a sort of sense of,
I don't know if I'm totally getting
I'm sorry,
what you're saying, but maybe like it's the like the completion of the logic, or like you were saying earlier, the crown, because pornography is like sexual identity through identifying with like the object, and then like the opposite sex would be the ultimate object, because that's the thing that I don't, that is not my subjective experience.
Yeah, that's much better said than I said.
So again, it's not like a slippery slope argument, but you can see how it's kind of the crowned like form of what is already being done, or the most extreme form of what's already being done. Like my sexual arousal, my sexual identity is coming from this object that I identify with, this third party. I think that
there's a lot more to think about, obviously. So it seems that the education of people into this certain mode was going to have its effects. And it seems like most generally you can see how it supports our basic ideas about what sex means. Like, what I'm saying is, within a pornographic world, all of it kind of makes sense. And
yeah, like identifying yourself with the object that you see is it feels more natural.
Yeah.
It's the thing that we are all doing, and maybe that's not the thing that turns me on, but I can conceive of that making sense for you if it's within this logic. So I can support it and affirm it because I'm basically doing the same thing.
Totally. I mean, just think about what that means to say. It's like, if sex has become pornography, then all we're really doing is saying what individual thing I like and get out of pornography, but it has no sort of natural authority. And I see this often, I think, in this kind of weird reaction to transgenderism, where we live in an odd world, right? Where we're like most scientific and we're very hardcore about the sort of facts of biology, but then we're also involved in this great transgender project. But it seems like often the reaction and the corruption are part of the same reality. So if it's the case that we have sort of kicked any bonds of the church and are all indulging in pornography as our source of education on sex, then it seems like there is a fundamental, something laughable about the claim to like being a straight heterosexual male. Like, if that means identifying with the genitals of another male, like,
right.
Like certainly there could be other things. Like, I guess it's not the same as identifying with the opposite sex, sure, but there's something that's very
not masculine.
Yeah, not masculine about it. And so it just seems like there's a certain way in which there's like an overemphasis on how normal heterosexuality is, even though it's obviously like very abnormal right now.
Right.
So
like, why are we so insistent that this is the masculine thing?
Yeah.
Unless there was like some kind of shame about it. Like this, I mean, I think everyone knows that it makes you less feminine. It makes you less masculine. This is nothing admirable, nothing masculine about it.
Yeah. And so when we see the self-identified transgender person, I think it's not that we see something that's contra nature or something that's like breaking a moral code that we hold. I think it's the great risk that we all have in and through pornography addiction. And so we have to kind of swing the other way. It's like, well, this person is identifying with the other sex, takes pleasure in identifying with the other sex, and I'm looking at avatar bodies, but through what turns me on, it's just the same sex. And we must be at some level very aware of how tenuous that identification is, and how it can be manipulated, and how even our own concern for novelty tempts us into different directions. Like, the whole thing is not
it's fragile.
It's very fragile. And so it seems like saying like, oh, this transgender thing is absolutely absurd. How could people possibly believe it? Anyways, back to identifying, back to being both male and female within the act of masturbation, as I reduce the entire act of procreation to this externalized visual stimulus, and identify just with the right sex, my sex. I mean, it just seems to be like exactly what you would expect would be to have both phenomena, the full disassociation of yourself and then the reaction against that being really strong. One other thing, I think we got to wrap up, but one other thing I'd like to just mention is that I think it should be clear, hopefully, and as mentioned, that this is not to deny the reality of gender dysphoria as coming from a totally different place. It's simply to say that when we have this sort of cultural habit, that it makes more sense to take what's previously considered to be symptoms of mental illness into simply object preference choices and acts of self-identification, which is obviously what we've seen. I mean, if
right,
you look
if this is the norm now, then it's just, this is nature. This is not a problem to like trying to figure out or get to the root of. It's just, what is my preference?
Yeah.
It's not questioned. The form isn't questioned, right, because this is what I was introduced to. This is how I was initiated into sexuality, into the adult world. Yeah. I take it as nature.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, I mean, what's needed here, unfortunately, is chastity. And that's difficult. But the reason that the church has just constantly proclaimed chastity as a necessary virtue, and then also as a result of extolling that particular virtue, said that we should let sexual love be sexual and not make it masturbatory, like to oppose contraception, to oppose anything that would take essentially the danger out of sex. That really has offended the world, I think, for a long time, is that the church seems to be the one that says this shouldn't be safe. The church is the one that says you need to be open to life. You need to be open to problems. You need to do it forever. You need to be, you need to make this hard, and it's about sacrifice. And all these old things that were like, no, isn't it now? Like that's the scary stuff, and what we really want is for us to say, like, no, it's just the safety of porn, masturbation. It's just sometimes you do it with other people, but don't worry, they're sterilized. Those have clearly, I think, become the two just very distinct attitudes and ways of living out the fact of sexuality. And so, do one, not the other, I guess, is the advice there.
All right. I think
Okay.
that's it.
Cool. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.